Story 1. I was an apprentice doing a heating, ventilation, and air conditioning renovation. I took down some drywall from a bulkhead, and 10,000 used condoms fell down on top of me. The bulkhead was open on the other side of the wall where their son's bedroom was. I couldn't talk about it for months because the very thought would make me convulse. Story 2. I had a friend in school whose family were hoarders. In addition to the usual items like pet waste and dead mice, we once dug through the clutter in his bedroom for something, and I realized it was made up of layers that started with baby toys and clothes at the bottom, followed by elementary school items, and so on. It resembled a very depressing fossil record. We were in early high school at that time. Story 3. I was doing an internet install about 10 years ago. While running cable through a drop ceiling, we came across a Ziploc bag full of panties and a binder with Polaroids of naked crying women. The homeowners we were installing for had just moved in, so we didn't think it was theirs and asked them to take a look. They called the police. I'm not sure what happened after that, but I'm pretty sure the previous owner was a serial killer. Story 4. I had a side job with a restoration company for a couple of years. We cleaned houses after furnaces caused soot issues, and I cleaned the walls and floors of a teenage boy who had about 35 bottles of urine under his bed. The mother was mortified when we found it because he had no medical issues and just didn't feel like stopping his video games to get up and use the restroom. There were a few used condoms under the bed as well. Story 5. I wish I had a photo to share. Years ago, I had unusual neighbors. They were a married couple, and he was definitely weirder than she was. The first and only time I visited their house was when I moved in and some of their mail ended up in my mailbox. I took it back to them and they invited me in. I stepped inside, turned to the right, and saw it. They had a large old floor model console television from the 1970s, and standing proudly behind it was a white plaster statue of a man the same height as, and with facial features resembling those of the husband, and it was totally nude with its genitals resting on the top of the television. I made a quick exit. Story 6. I went out with a friend for drinks. We met a few guys at the bar and decided to hang out with them after closing time to play card games at one of their houses. Once we arrived, there was an elderly man sitting on the couch with a case of beer. We went into the dining room, and the guy staying there went into the kitchen and turned on the light. I kid you not, the whole floor started moving. Bugs were everywhere. They scattered up the walls. I was really freaked out. My friend asked where the bathroom was, and he looked at her and said, "Yes, there are bugs in there too," all irritated. Needless to say, we didn't stay long. Story 7. During my teenage years, my friends and I visited the house of another boy from our school for the first time. One of my friends, exploring his room, opened a pencil case that was filled with short curly hair. When asked about it, he casually admitted that he had been collecting his own hair for no particular reason. Judging by the quantity, he had been doing it for quite some time. Story 8. I cannot recall specific details, but someone cleaned up dog diarrhea from the kitchen floor using a mop and bucket. They then poured it into the kitchen sink and cleaned the mop there, right in front of me. It was disgusting. Story 9. When I was little, I was told not to open a specific old suitcase that my grandparents had in the closet. After they passed away, my dad went through their things, and I didn't know it was filled to the brim with adult toys and magazines. Story 10. I went to buy a beautiful house that was for sale by the government because it had been repossessed. In the basement, there was a radiator with chains and blood around it. There were fingernail scratches on the wall and some bullet holes as well. The previous owner had been trafficking girls and had kept them locked to the radiator in the basement. Story 11. When I was a child, we were extremely poor and had seen all types of houses. There was one house belonging to a couple that I only heard about through my mother's description. They were hoarders and had many dogs. I think they collected strays. According to my mother, there was trash and dog waste piled everywhere, with nothing more than a shoveled path through some rooms. When my mother returned to the car after dropping something off to them, she was gagging and ended up vomiting. The sad thing was that the woman was one of the nicest people I have ever known. She would always bring us extra food she collected from food pantries and occasionally house sat for us. The only downside was that, just like her house, she had an overpowering smell, which earned her the local nickname of Catfish. To this day, She remains the most intensely smelling person I have ever encountered. I always wanted to thank her for the help she provided, despite her living conditions not being much better than my family's. Unfortunately, none of us knew her actual name. Story 12. When I was a child, the neighbors across the street were a bit peculiar. However, there weren't many children my age to play with, so I had to make do. The only time I was brave enough to enter their house, I saw a raccoon sitting on the kitchen counter, eating something it was holding in its paws. Both the kids and the parents acted as if it was completely normal. Story 13. During a dorm inspection, one member had a Ziploc bag containing either fingernails or toenails. I would have preferred to see something else. Story 14. I went with a friend to pick up some marijuana. We ended up at the dealer's girlfriend's place. She had a cup with a substance on the windowsill. Story 15. Sitting in a neighbor's house with a few friends, I spotted a group of slugs traversing the living room carpet like they owned the place. When I cautiously brought this to the actual owner's attention, the reply was, "No worries. All these old terraced houses have nests of slugs in the pipes. Take no notice. They'll soon be gone." Well, I couldn't stop looking, and they were slugs. They were not soon gone. The more I looked, the more shiny trails I found. Everywhere. The carpet, of course, but also up the curtains and across the walls. But that wasn't the worst of it. For some reason, I decided to have a closer inspection of these unappealing mollusks. That was a bad idea. Each one was literally crawling with tiny creatures. Mites of some kind, maybe scuttling about all over them. My own old slug-free terraced house had never seemed more inviting, and it was later for me. Story 16. I went to a boy's house for the first time. I found several pictures of his mother, whom I had just met, in various drawers and even sitting on his desk. He was arrested 2 weeks later for child pornography. Story 17. Helping a friend move, I realized that mold was growing from the carpet and up the legs of the furniture. It's truly something you cannot unsee. Story 18. Decades ago, my friend's father passed away, and we were clearing out his old house before my friends sold the place. We came across an old stash in the attic, a Super 8 projector and a collection of old Super 8 movies. Most of the movies were unlabeled, but one that had a label, presumably professionally distributed, was titled Anal Dwarf. From the cover, the dwarf was the pitcher. These days, that content might seem rather tame. Far stranger material is readily available online. At the time, it felt quite odd, and my friend insisted on throwing out everything without examining the unlabeled movies, despite my curiosity about their contents. She was visibly disturbed by the whole incident, likely because it was her father's collection. Story 19. I am a social worker for children and their families and visit other people's homes nearly every day. The most disturbing experience was seeing hundreds of bedbugs climbing on the couch. In broad daylight, they swarmed everywhere. The mattresses were infested as well. Unfortunately, it is not considered a safety issue, so we cannot remove children for that reason. Fortunately, it was at an adult sibling's home that took in the younger ones after they were removed from their mother. I was able to move them out of that situation quickly and into a different relative's home. I advised the new placement not to take any clothes or bedding from them. Story 20. I was dating this guy in my early 20s, and he invited me over to his place for dinner one night. His apartment was messier than I keep my own, but not too bad for a 23-year-old. We ate, and as I brought my dishes to the sink, I offered to wash them, but he said no and told me to leave my plate on the counter. We watched TV, hung out, went to sleep, and I completely forgot about it until I was back at his place again maybe 3 to 4 weeks later. My plate was exactly where I left it, including all the food remnants on it. Story 21. A collection of bacula is displayed in an antique case, featuring a row of the owner's deceased pet skulls at the front. She would bury them in the yard after they died, set a date reminder on her calendar, and then dig them up later after the insects had cleaned everything. I was a mobile pet groomer at the time. Story 22. I went with my mother-in-law to a friend's house to pick up a coffee table. When we arrived, I really needed to use the bathroom. I asked if I could use her bathroom. She said yes, but to use the bathroom in the bedroom. As I walked through the bedroom to the bathroom, I noticed 10 giant dildos lined up on her nightstand. One was a big rubber fist. She had to know I saw them, but she acted completely normal when I came out. Story 23. Technically, it was my house. I had just bought it and it came with a fridge. The fridge was on and empty, except for a dead bird in a bag. Story 24. I rented a house where the previous tenant had moved out and left his dog behind. It was a large dog in a bedroom. The mess had been picked up from the wooden floor, but that was the extent of the cleanup. There were stains on the walls as well. So I bought a liquid cleaner and a mop and kept bringing in pans of boiling water that I poured down the walls, which were plaster, and over the floor. I scrubbed for hours, returned the next day, and still smelled the dog mess. I probably would have smelled it regardless, but I did a second round of cleaning. I must have used a deck brush on those floors. It was a significant mess, but the rent was only $50, and the bus stop was 2 houses away. Story 25. Once I went to a man's apartment to pick up some marijuana. I have seen many stoner dens in my time, but this one was special. The smell. Imagine setting up a cheese platter for 50 people, comprised of the most pungent European cheeses you can find, and letting it rot for 3 weeks in high summer. Then you smear it over all the walls and work it into the carpet. I thought a few minutes would make my brain ignore it, but it didn't work. The strange thing was, the apartment was not even that messy. I have no idea where that smell came from. Story 26. We were house shopping. I opened a hall closet door and found several strap-on fake breast vests hanging from hangers and a stack of 4-foot-tall wooden paddles with holes drilled in them leaning against the wall. I mean, one of each is just a kink, but half a dozen is a party. Story 27. This falls into the unusual category. I house sat for a couple who owned a large collection of taxidermied animals, resembling a natural history museum display. The man had clearly been on safari in Africa several times, as evidenced by the life-sized mounted leopard on the wall. They were quite eccentric and compensated me generously. Story 28. One time, we upgraded our entertainment system, and a former employee said she could use the old one. We had a truck, so we delivered it. She offered us some banana bread she had baked that morning. We followed her to the kitchen and watched her brush off ants and roaches before slicing it and handing it to each of us. For years, we were both under the impression that her carpeting was dark brown, but it was actually taupe. The part that surprised me was that she was quite meticulous about cleanliness at work, but at home, it was different. Story 29. Not my story, but my wife's friend explained how when she went to her boyfriend's house for the first time, the carpet underneath his desk was rock hard and stained yellow. When she gathered the courage to confront him about it and tell him she thought it was gross, he had his mother clean it with her carpet cleaner. Story 30. We had a neighbor a few houses down when we were kids. The mother worked at the Christian school, but the children were homeschooled, which was questionable since the father also worked full-time. They had 5 or 6 children and many animals. Cats, dogs, rabbits, and chickens. They allowed all the animals inside the house. The animals made quite a mess, and no one ever cleaned it up. They simply walked around it. The smell was awful. I only went inside once to check on one of the children who had broken his leg. Story 31. Oh God, there are so many strange experiences. I've known some unusual people. The worst had to be the home of one of my girlfriend's friends from high school. It was an old mansion filled with decades worth of hoarding. It had high ceilings and trash was piled up higher than any average person could reach, so they must have been throwing it up there. The basement was the least problematic, possibly because it was so difficult to access. However, there was a fruit cellar. It was in use. Rows upon rows of jars filled with purple, orange, and green liquids. This was in 2009, and it wouldn't surprise me if those jars were sealed in the 1960s or 1970s. We went there once and never spoke of it again. Story 32. I am not the tittiest person in the world. In fact, I'm quite messy. However, a reality check I had 6 years ago was when a friend invited me to smoke with some acquaintances in downtown Chicago. We ended up driving all the way to Montrose Beach and met these guys in an apartment on the 23rd or 30th floor of a building. When they opened the door, I kid you not, I was met with one of the most beautiful views I had ever seen, followed by the realization that the apartment was trash. You could not see a speck of carpet because it was covered in layers of takeout bags, cola bottles, most of them still containing soda, trash, pizza boxes, toilet paper rolls, tissue paper. Everything they had ever bought while living there was just thrown onto the floor. I wanted to take pictures, but it would have been too obvious. I don't let people into my apartment when all my clothes are scattered on the floor, so I couldn't understand how they would let us see that. They invited more friends, and at one point there were 9 of us there. I remember they told me I could sit on the couch, but it looked so grimy that they gave me a blanket to put on top of it. The blanket was damp. We had brought food, but I couldn't eat it. My appetite vanished immediately. We were mostly girls there, and to this day I tell myself, the things we do for a smoke. Interestingly enough, the bathroom was decent compared to the mess outside. All of the upholstery was somehow damp, and I still don't know why. I don't remember it smelling of rotting food, just what I can only describe as moisture. To top it all off, I was wearing shorts, and I was a bit scared for my safety. I never saw them again. Story 33. I remember going into a friend's house and seeing rows of glasses and alcoholic bottles stacked everywhere. I gained respect for her for enduring a situation she could not escape. Story 34. I was hanging out with my roommate in her room and happened to glance into an open drawer, where I saw several dildos and butt plugs that were covered in human waste. I assume it was my roommate's, although that is unconfirmed. Story 35. Bottles of urine. The person couldn't get up from his gaming to walk across the corridor to use the bathroom. There are no mental health issues, just laziness and unpleasant behavior. Story 36. There was a hoarder in our building, and the property manager offered her free help from 3 volunteers to clean it up, but she refused. We tried to help her before, and she wouldn't accept assistance. It was extremely unpleasant. She had one of those 5-pound bags of shredded cheese that I mistook for spinach because it was so dark green. The situation was just appalling, with trash stacked similarly to the pictures shared online. She would bring homeless individuals back to her place, resulting in filthy mattresses and other items stacked from floor to ceiling. I have only been here since 2018, and I know she had to throw out at least 3 mattresses. They had to hire professionals because they dragged a mattress across the carpet to get it outside. Eventually, they reported her to the Department of Health, and she was required to clean it up but did not, which led to her eviction. The situation posed a safety hazard for the entire building. She was constantly spreading bedbugs and roaches. It was truly horrifying. Someone mentioned she has lived here for over 20 years. Story 37. I was living with my ex and doing a big spring clean of my belongings. I went into the office to get some boxes I had stored in the closet and found a pair of his sweatpants covered with numerous stains. They were unpleasant and crusty. I threw them away, informed him I found them, and he erupted in anger at me for going through his things and spying on him. Yes, we broke up shortly after that. Story 38. A rubber object hangs from a nightstand with a glass of spoiled milk on top, causing it to dangle off the side. Story 39. Staying over at my in-laws' house, I woke up around 3 a.m. and headed downstairs for a glass of water. My father-in-law was still awake in the living room watching a movie, though I was not sure which one. Everything seemed fine, so I went back to bed. I heard him come upstairs and go to bed about 10 minutes later. The next morning, I was the first person to get up, so I went downstairs and turned on the television. It defaulted to the channel that was on when it was turned off the night before, a pay-per-view adult film channel. He had been watching adult films while I was in the next room getting a glass of water. It wasn't the weirdest or most disgusting thing in the world, but it definitely made me quite wary during future sleepovers, and I learned to keep a bottle of water upstairs at all times. Story 40. Bathtub brew is a mixture of baker's yeast, frozen fruit, rice, and tap water, fermenting in their bathtub for drinking to get intoxicated. Why, you ask? Poverty, trauma, and addiction are compounded by living in an isolated community that prohibits the sale of alcohol. Story 41. I met a random person whose house was filled with waist-high mountains of used tissues. I only visited once, and he is known as the Tissue Man in local folklore. Story 42. Something that is both depressing and reassuring about the replies here is the idea that I am not alone in the Raised by a Hoarder Club. It breaks you in ways I am still learning about. I hope all these people received help eventually. Story 43. Disgusting and strange all at once. I used to work for a satellite television provider when I lived in Southern California. One day, I had a job to upgrade some outdated set-top boxes for an elderly female customer. She lived on a main street but had a driveway, so I pulled my van in. A chest-high chain-link fence surrounded her property. Her home was on the right with a detached garage on the left, connected by a concrete walkway. The first thing I noticed that was unusual was the at least 100 paper plates scattered across her front yard. She was sitting on her porch waiting for me. I turned off my van, got out, and as I walked up, she politely greeted me at her fence. She was a very sweet old woman. I could hear several dogs barking in the detached garage, and as I walked through the gate toward her home, I saw about 5 or 6 of them, each a different breed, behind the metal screen door, making a lot of noise. I told her why I was there and explained my plan: to swap out 2 boxes and maybe realign her satellite dish if necessary. I then asked to see the 2 boxes. As she opened the front door, a powerful stench hit me, and I saw her living room and kitchen area. The wood floors were covered with a solid layer of dog feces and urine, even piled up in the corners of the room. Before I arrived, she had hastily mopped a path of thinly smeared yellow excrement leading toward the back rooms where the televisions were. The mopped part of the floor seemed to make the smell worse. I almost couldn't do it. My eyes burned and teared up, but I knew if I refused, my supervisor would have to step in, and I thought it would make me look weak. So I gritted my teeth and went in. She led me down the yellow path to the first room. It was small, more like a large closet than a bedroom. It had a single television and a small bed with a filled bookshelf on the wall. She pointed further down the hall, saying the final television was in the room on the right. I peeked in from the hallway, saw it, and told her I'd get the boxes and start swapping them. We walked back outside. I grabbed the equipment from my van and hauled it all to the first room. She decided to stay outside and let me work. She was so polite and sweet that I think, subconsciously, I tried to act like everything was normal to avoid embarrassing her. I didn't even wear a face mask upon re-entry. In the first room, I remember it being incredibly dusty, as if no one had lived in it for some time. The books on the shelves had the thickest black dust I'd ever seen. I didn't know dust could gather like that on books, as if they had been untouched for years. Everything else in the room, though, was relatively clean. Even the bed was made. Set-top boxes had a long boot and download sequence, so after setting up the first one, I moved to the second room. This is where things got strange. The second room was the master bedroom, and it had no dog feces anywhere. When I walked in, I saw the television, then looked to my right and saw a king-size bed on an antique dark wood frame with white sheets. However, the sheets looked like someone had taken a large knife to them, slashing through the fabric and exposing the yellow mattress stuffing. There were at least 5 to 10 long, irregular gouges. Fortunately, there was no blood. Suddenly, I heard a huge crash from the main room, followed by the sound of the dogs charging through the house, looking for me. I quickly shut and locked the bedroom door. Being a single-story home in Southern California, the windows had metal bars on the outside. I was literally trapped between a group of frenzied dogs and a reinforced window in what felt like a dangerous situation. I waited for about 3 or 4 minutes before the sound of the dogs began to subside. Finally, when everything was quiet, I heard a knock at the door. It was the lady. I unlocked it, and she apologized, explaining that the dogs had gotten out by accident. I told her it was okay, swapped the box in the master bedroom, and once the channels finally showed up, gave her a quick rundown of how everything worked, then took her signature. Then I got out as quickly as I could. Later, I realized the paper plates were a warning. She fed the dogs on those plates and never cleaned them up. It was the same pattern with the feces and urine in the house. She was a small woman, And I still feel bad for her because the dogs clearly controlled the home, and she couldn't keep up with them. I didn't ask her any personal questions, so I don't know if she lived with someone else. But how two separate people could live in that home and be okay with it is beyond me. I met many people while working at the satellite television provider, and this was one of the many strange situations that will always stick with me. Thank you for reading. Story 44. When I was 16, my family was helping a woman who was a hoarder. In the very back room, we found a decomposed squirrel stuck to the window. Story 45. Some people have been disturbed by the fact that my dad's ashes were on a shelf in our living room. There are many unusual items kept in my household for fun. Story 46. My grandfather's house was built in the 1600s and was captured by the natives during King Philip's War. In one of the cabinets, there was a handmade native doll with a note saying that if the doll ever left the house would burn, and the person who removed it would have bad luck. All my cousins and I loved looking at the note and doll every time we visited, but it was very creepy. Story 47. When we were looking at houses, we saw one where the owners had mostly removed all but the most generic decorations. On top of the cabinets, they had left two gnome statues, one male and one female. They were naked, with one gnome displaying male anatomy and the other having sagging breasts, both staring at prospective buyers with grins. We bought the house. No, the gnomes did not come with it, but they did leave us numerous clothes hangers. Story 48. A dying puppy was being fed human food and had an empty bowl. Then they left it to die with me. I took it to the veterinarian and surrendered it for treatment, hoping it would survive. Story 49. An extra-large movie theater soda cup filled to the top with spit. I was 19 or 20, preparing at another girl's house for a party. She smoked a mixture of tobacco and cannabis and had to spit frequently afterward, so she saved the spit in cups, as it was too much of a hassle to go to the bathroom each time. I never returned there. Story 50. A baby food jar with baby teeth in it. Every baby tooth her kids had. I know some people think that's cute or sweet, but not me. Dead teeth are disgusting. Story 51. In a friend's bedroom, on a mirror hanging on the wall, is every piece of gum they had ever chewed. Tame compared to the other replies. Story 52. A man had a little trouble cleaning up after his puppy. There was mess everywhere on the floor. It still makes me feel queasy if I think about it for more than a few seconds. Story 53. I went to a limousine party a friend of mine was having for one of her milestone birthdays. It was her 21st, and her parents had splurged on a ride around London for 6 of us. It was arranged that since my friend and I didn't live close by, we could stay in the spare room at my friend's parents' house that night. This was my first time staying at her place. It was only the second time I had met this mutual friend as well. We ended up in the spare room, which had a rather large single bed, we topped and tailed. It was odd but comfy. However, the floor in the room was covered with stuff. You literally could not see the floor at all. We had to wade through all this clutter to get to the bed. It was akin to wading through a ball pit. All the other rooms were quite neat from what I recall. Just that one room was absolutely trashed. Story 54. I was at a friend's house during the summer while we were both home from university. We were playing Xbox and my controller batteries were dying. He told me there were fresh batteries in the top drawer of his bedside table. Just as I opened the drawer, he shouted, "Wait!" There were also batteries so we could continue playing Black Ops Zombies. Story 55. In a photo album, behind a picture of me as a baby, was another picture of me as a baby, emerging from my mother's body. Story 56. Free-range roaches crawl on the floor, walls, ceiling, and furniture. You can easily count a dozen at any moment. Story 57. A Ku Klux Klan flag in the living room. The living room was arranged like a meeting space, which I assumed was for church meetings. There was a whiteboard at the front and some chairs. The flag was positioned off to the side, so I didn't notice it at first. I left quickly. Story 58. It wasn't a thing technically, but when I used the bathroom at my sister-in-law's house, I got stuck to the toilet. Story 59. My great-aunt passed away a month ago, and I went to help with everything. We had to clean up her house and found many interesting things, including a postcard from 1906, pictures of my mother's father and my great-aunt as children, and a copy of my mother's wedding invitation. At one point, we discovered a page from a newspaper featuring an advertisement for a vaudeville performer, my great-great-grandfather. He was a blackface comedian. I needed some time to process that. Story 60. My classmate's private photos were discovered by her younger sister and me while we were using her computer to look at anime art and music. It wasn't the worst situation, but it became uncomfortable because my classmate exhibited erratic behavior. She later began dating the man who had assaulted her sister and even expressed enjoyment about his scent, while simultaneously shaming her sister for supposedly tempting him. It was an unsettling experience overall. Story 61. Cleaning out my grandparents' house after my uncle passed away, I found used adult diapers in a pile of belongings on my grandma's old bed. She had passed away 7 years earlier. I am fairly certain they were hers. No amount of gloves and sanitizer helped with that. Story 62. My coworkers and I had a gathering of about 6 to 8 people at one of the guys' houses. We were drinking, so there were lots of bathroom breaks, and we would go in groups of 2 or 3 at a time, as girls do. The first round of people mentioned seeing an empty toilet paper roll with a condom on it on the counter. I didn't see it, but when I went in next, it was a guess what moment. He must have thrown it away only after realizing people had noticed it. Story 63. We enter many houses. We have discovered soda bottles filled with urine because the teenage grandson was too lazy to use the bathroom. In one house without water, the occupant used 5-gallon buckets for bathroom needs and stored them on the back porch with about 20 buckets. Another house without a functioning bathroom handled the situation similarly, taking the full bucket to the field and burying the contents. Lastly, there was a person who filled the tub with waste because the toilet ceased functioning. He urinated outside. Story 64. I haven't found anything significant, but I occasionally go to my neighbor's garage to smoke. There are stains on the walls and desk that make it look like he makes a mess in random spots. I almost felt sick when I saw it. Story 65. As someone who has completed many renovations, I retain much information in my memory. However, there are a few details that slip through. Animals and people can be more disturbing than one might imagine. For instance, rats hoarding bloody cloth under the floorboards of a third-story bathroom and individuals keeping chickens inside their living spaces. Bad experiences. Vault closed. Story 66. Weeds are growing in the carpet. On a side note, my friend's younger brother hit me with a wooden toy phone and gave me a bump on my forehead. I have no idea why it happened. The mother grabbed her husband's underwear, put some ice in it, and said it was the only clean thing she had. Story 67. I belong to a veterans organization. A group of us volunteered to help an elderly woman with an autistic son clean up. We opened the front door to find the living room, dining room, and kitchen area covered in trash about a foot deep. The smell was beyond words. It turned out there were about 100 pounds of cat droppings in one corner of the kitchen. Story 68. I visited a friend's house and asked to use the restroom. I accidentally walked into the wrong room, which I believe belonged to her brother, and saw a massive wet ball of cat hairballs. Story 69. Not another person's house, but it was a nasty little surprise left for me by the previous occupant of my barracks room. There were some suspicious stains on the wall near the bed. It looked like a bodily fluid and was fluorescent under a black light. I scrubbed and sanitized it thoroughly. Story 70. A mutual friend joked about having a secret nut jar with one of his friend groups. I talked to another guy in the group about it, and he nearly confirmed it during our conversation. I hope it's just some foul inside joke. But let's be honest, the guy's name is Garrett. Story 71. A large dresser drawer, where you would normally store t-shirts and similar items, is filled to the brim with used sanitary pads. I still remember the smell from 1997. Story 72. I used to spend time with people who lived in cluttered environments, where they discarded garbage on the floor after finishing something. Their apartment smelled of stale cigarettes. One night, I invited the daughter and her boyfriend over, and he acted as if my house was the same as their apartment, tossing his trash on the floor. I told him to throw his trash in the garbage can in the kitchen because I did not live like that. Story 73. Once, when I entered my sister's room, I noticed cat vomit on the floor. For weeks, I watched that vomit slowly congeal as she stepped over it. It remained there for months. Yes, I could have cleaned it, but I was curious about how long she would leave it since it was her cat and her room, making it her responsibility. Story 74. I went to a friend's house in junior high and saw blood-stained underwear on the floor of her bedroom. She then threw it under the bed and blamed it on her sister. Story 75. I visited a friend's house once, and he had a melted tub of Haagen-Dazs on the floor, leaking. I also found used KFC packaging in his bathtub when I went to use the bathroom. Story 76. I used to go to people's houses to set them up for continuous positive airway pressure testing. The entire inside of this one house was unpleasant due to two chain smokers who lived there. The carpet was heavy with smoke with every step I took. The ceiling was yellow from it. The man's bed literally had 3 overflowing ashtrays piled up on a side table next to it, along with a dark yellow stain in the outline of his body on the sheets. I almost gagged from the smell, and I was left smelling like an ashtray for a week afterward. Story 77. Dirty item behind a bed. The situation was unpleasant. May everyone find cleanliness and fulfillment in this life. Story 78. 2 5-gallon containers in a smoker's room smelled terrible, reminiscent of an unpleasant odor. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.